I talk on occasion in the book, Case for Character, about the creedal frame. And maybe that sounds a little more heavy or more regimented than it actually is. The idea of the creedal frame is simply learning to see the whole idea of the Christian life within the context of the creed. And what I mean by that is recognizing that the creed itself, and I'm talking about the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or even the Athanasian Creed, the key end part of it especially, that the creed is simply telling a story. It's actually an outline, if you think about it, of the economy of salvation. God who creates, man who rebels, and then Christ who is sent to redeem and restore the creation, and the Holy Spirit who is at work to accomplish and bring to fruition all that the Son had accomplished, and finally bring to consummation all of God's beautiful plan. So the creed, from the first article through the second and ending in the third, is simply telling the story of God's love for His creation, of God's economy, this plan of salvation. That's what the creed is. So when we talk about a creedal frame, what I'm saying is we need to learn to see our lives and our stories in the context of God's story, which is a very much virtue ethics way of talking, this whole idea of the narrative of God being normative, and then we see our narratives, our little life stories in God's larger story. This is really important for the church to get this figured out, because instead of the church trying to fit into the many stories of people's lives and trying to figure out how to be relevant to their important life stories, instead the church says, we are the place where we are telling God's story, we are living God's story, and we're inviting you, the individual people, to come and participate in God's story, and instead of the story of God fitting into your life, you fit into God's story. And you realize where your life makes sense and how it all comes together living in God's story. That's what I mean by the creedal frame. It's a realization that Christ actually comes for the sake of the entire world. Christ actually comes not just to rescue us out of a broken, dying world, but to restore and fix the broken, dying world. And He does the same for us. So we are restored to being fully human. Everything God created us to be. And when God is done restoring us, what does He do? Does He whisk us away from this material world to some other spiritual realm? Not at all. He returns us to the world, sends us back into the material world to do what we were created to do, to accomplish what He's given us to do. And at the eschatological fulfillment, when Christ comes again and all things are caught up in the end, the eschaton, when all of that finally comes to fruition, what will we be doing? What God always created us to do, accomplishing what humans do, serving the creation, caring for one another, serving and pleasing God simply by being fully human. So, what do we do now in our Christian lives? We rejoice in the gospel that gives us forgiveness. We rejoice in the gospel that makes us fully human, everything that we're supposed to be, and then we are driven out into the world to do what God gives us to do. That's the creedal frame. So in a sense, you realize that you are justified, made right with God, so that you can go out and do your vocations in the world. You're justified to accomplish what God has given you to do. That's what it means to be human. So the creedal frame is simply an awareness of the wide push of God's plan and your part in it, and a willingness to embrace the goodness of that material plan and the rightness of actually living God's story in your own life and living into God's story. It's really a beautiful picture when you see it in a holistic way like that.